All right, classmates, I'm going to start. So for those other folks who are joining us, thank you very much for chiming in. I'm Matt Basso. I'm sitting here in a conference room at the University of Utah, and our guest, who we're very thankful to have join us, Jennifer Holland, is in Norman, Oklahoma, home of the University of Oklahoma's gymnastics team. So that's not important. So it's our great pleasure to welcome you. Professor Holland is an assistant professor at University of Oklahoma. She importantly took a master's at Utah State University, and also importantly took a PhD at University of Wisconsin. I say that because one of the grad students here is about to go into start that PhD program. And because, of course, the University of Minnesota is a huge, angry rival, but that's a different issue entirely. Professor Holland is the author, as folks on here know, of Tiny U, A Western History of the Anti-Abortion Movement, recently out from the University of California Press, and already the winner of 4 prizes, the Caroline Bancroft Award, the Armitage Jameson Award from the Coalition for Western Women's History, the David Weber Award from the WHA, and also from WHA, the W. Turrentine Jackson Award. I am super excited to talk about this book and hear from Professor Holland about it. And I want to thank the folks who have allowed us to do that. And that's the Aileen Clyde Foundation. The Clyde Foundation is supporting the History Department and Marriott Library's efforts to build a new archive of 20th century women's stories. And there is no better book to represent the importance of an archive like this and archival efforts along these lines than this book, Tiny U. So I'm thrilled. My thanks again to the Clyde Foundation, to the Department of History, and to Utah Humanities, as well as other kind of co-sponsors. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Professor Holland.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for inviting me to come talk. And it's really, I love talking about this wherever I can, but I do have a special place in my heart for Utah, and actually especially the University of Utah, even though I never went there, but I spent so much good time down on that campus doing research. And also when I was living up in Logan, I would come down to the city. I just, it's a very special place. So I'm really pleased to talk virtually.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about this book. I guess I will begin really where my book begins, and that is with Trent Franks. Ooh, let me see if I can get this going here. So Trent Franks came of political age wearing a fetus on his lapel. The story of how the pin got there began in the shadow of the Cold War West, in a small mining town in southwestern Colorado. Franks's 1950s hometown, Irvin, was a typical yellow cake town, complete with company dominance and high levels of cancer. By the 1970s, he was working in another classically Western endeavor, oil drilling. But Franks began to chart a new career trajectory in Utah, where he took a course at the National Center for Constitutional Studies, which was formerly the Freeman Institute. And for those of you who don't know, the Freeman Institute was a religiously inspired right-wing free market group with links to the ultra-conservative John Birch Society. And Franks named this as a really important educational experience. But a short time later, he had his political epiphany, and it came in the form of a pro-life film. This is what he said. It showed a child in the throes of dying from a saline abortion. He said, it made an indelible imprint on my heart forever. Franks soon became, according to the National Review, a pro-life warrior. And one of the emblems of this war could be found on his jacket near his heart, where he wore, this is a quote, a tie tack in the shape of the feet of a fetus, a constant reminder of his anti-abortion rights views. So that's the first paragraph of my book. And I began the book with Franks because he captured some of the things that drew me to this project. He was emblematic of a certain kind of Western politics that had been unexplored or largely unexplored, sort of socially conservative politics whose main actors were religious white people. And also, he spoke to the powerful ways that anti-abortion culture shaped many Americans' sense of self at the end of the century. He also became this very famous spokesperson for some of their rhetoric. While he was in the US House, Franks suggested, somewhat famously, that African Americans were better off under slavery than in 21st century America because more were dying of abortion than had died under slavery. And he imagined his movement, which was the anti-abortion movement, as, quote, the civil rights struggle that will define our generation. Trent Franks told the Eagle Forum in 2014, if I die and Roe versus Wade still stands, I will die a failure. So I think you can see through Franks' language how the anti-abortion movement gave religious white conservatives a way to think of themselves as abolitionists and as part of a rights movement, as the power of those rhetorics grows at the end of the century. And that emerging sense of self that the movement provided was really anchored by fetal ephemera, which ended up in pockets and on lapels and in America's churches and in its schools. So this book examines the anti-abortion movements in 4 states, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. And in it, Tiny U argues that anti-abortion activists made the political personal to many white Americans. That activists brought this fetal imagery and its attendant politics into crisis pregnancy centers and onto public thoroughfares and to schools, churches, and homes. And they inserted fetal politics into profoundly intimate relationships between husband and wife, child and parent, and people and their God. And that's just a few. And these politics invited socially conservative people to think of themselves as abolitionists and also the nation's saviors. In the process, activists developed and fostered a constituency of Americans for whom anti-abortion politics was essential to their sense of self, to how they thought of themselves. And when these personal politics were successful, activists helped their audience identify with and see themselves in the fetus. They helped people think of the fetus as a tiny you. So, as you've gleaned, perhaps, anti-abortion political activism was cultural work, and it infiltrated the seemingly apolitical spaces of people's lives. Activists took, of course, the famous gory photos of aborted fetuses, but also fetus dolls, embalmed fetuses, videos of abortions, symbolic funerals, and cemeteries into private and public spaces. And when they did that, they waged a war for hearts and minds. And the ongoing legislative battles, which I think historians have been more attentive to, they dominated many state governments, but those battles were predicated on this more intimate activism. They were built on ecumenical organizing in religious communities, where the devout recited prayers against abortion, heard anti-abortion sermons, read about local political efforts, and watched anti-abortion films. They were built on activism done in crisis pregnancy centers, which beckoned pregnant women to their doors and implicitly offered abortion referrals, but only offered anti-abortion counseling. They built on educational activism that activists did with young people in schools and churches and homes. And they built on family values politics that activists employed in arenas large and small, from self-help groups to state houses. By the 80s and 90s, activists had made the fetus central to how many a conservative and many an American thought about being a woman and a child and a Christian and a member of a family. And this book, I think, explains how social conservatives remade the subjectivities of many religious white people at the end of the 20th century, and how that cultural work in turn changed the partisan politics of the American West. Now, at the heart of this movement was a few essential discourses that really never changed from the beginning to the end. And one core one was that they envisioned abortion as evidence of the perversion of modern science, a genocide akin to the Holocaust, and a product of racist or otherwise hierarchical thinking that privileged some lives over others. And so they made the fetus into a victim of modern society and their campaign into a justice movement. And they claimed through these analogies and also hierarchizing the analogies that only through the protection of the fetus could Americans successfully protect the rights of all oppressed people. So you have conservative activists borrowing the rhetoric of civil rights, which of course was an ideology forged in the crucible of Southern segregation and extended in campaigns for the rights of women, Latinx people, Native Americans, LGBTQ people, and many others. Anti-abortion activists took that elastic but liberal rhetoric and put it to conservative ends. And this rhetorical turn was essential and born out of a moment of racial transformation in the United States. The 1970s is a moment when Americans began to recast the civil rights movement as righteous and not riotous as they had. And you have Southerners who resisted desegregation being left out of history's moral arc. And so many white conservatives had to rethink the moral and ideological basis of whiteness in the aftermath of a civil rights movement that made the defense of segregation and white supremacy, at least publicly, untenable. So through this civil rights movement for fetuses, regular white people could be both the victims of modernity and also its potential saviors. And that was a potent combination. So my book looks at Western states, not because the movement was born there or bigger there or stronger there or more innovative there. This region was like many other regions. Its activists innovated some strategies, but mostly mimicked others from around the country. But I do think that this regional study of anti-abortion activists helps us see the transformations in the region's politics and also a national movement through new eyes. It shows why new right seeds sown earlier, in decades earlier, bloomed at the end of the 20th century. And I really contend in this book that it wasn't liberty that motivated the Western turn to the right in the late 70s and 80s, but life. And in the Mountain West and elsewhere, the anti-abortion movement really remade the party of Barry Goldwater. Perhaps famously, Barry Goldwater was not opposed to legal abortion, and his wife was a big supporter of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Perhaps less famously, he got his daughter an illegal abortion in the 1950s. But by the 1980s, he had to win the anti-abortion vote to keep his Senate seat in Arizona, so he had to sort of briefly say he was going to toe the anti-abortion line in order to win, and he won barely, but he won. So when two political scientists, Teresa Marchant Shapiro and Kelly D. Patterson, analyzed the motivations for the Republican wave in the Mountain West in the 80s, they found two issues compelled the region's voters: distrust of the federal government and abortion. And I think as Western historians, we know a lot about the former and not much about the latter. So I want to give you one brief example from my book to sort of give you a sense of these intimate politics and the way they really reshape people's relationship to fetuses. And so I'm going to take you to my favorite chapter in the book, which is about the ways in which the anti-abortion movement politicized children in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. So in the anti-abortion movement in the 80s and 90s, in these years, children were symbols. They had for many years taken children out into protest, but they were also more than symbols for the movement. They were increasingly a primary audience for anti-abortion appeals and activism. And that was because in the anti-abortion worldview, liberals had begun brainwashing children and young people through the media and public schools and many other institutions. And so young people seemed, in short, to be a potentially pro-choice generation. And so activists, anti-abortion activists, hope to counteract this, what they saw as corruption. And so they felt like they had to wage a counter battle, politicizing children in order to make them innocent again. And in practice, that meant bringing the abortion wars with their attendant graphic imagery and discussions of immorality, murder, and holocausts into the haven of childhood. And so in the last 2 decades of the century, anti-abortion activists increasingly remake youth spaces into anti-abortion spaces, and also foster a new cadre of activists. So the topic of abortion entered public schools. This is one of these sites that activists sort of remake into anti-abortion spaces. And they entered schools even before the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision. In the late 60s, there's a public conversation about the ethics of abortion escalating. And at that moment, some teachers asked students to learn about the issue more and form an opinion. And so that creates these pedagogical openings in junior high and high schools, which then both pro-choice and pro-life activists come to sort of offer their opposing viewpoints. And very quickly, anti-abortion activists made school education this essential part of their movement. So they come really first as activists, and then as they detail in the book, in the 80s and 90s, schools become less comfortable with overt activism, but also this is a moment of flowering around abstinence education. And the way that the laws and funding worked, it made it very easy for anti-abortion activists to simply sort of retool their talks and sort of become abstinence educators. And a lot of major pro-life institutions sort of become these major generators of abstinence education. But sort of, especially in the 80s and 90s, as these talks escalate and as they move, both between activism and abstinence education, anti-abortion activists began to combine their sort of classic tools, these slideshows, as sort of both living fetuses, but also often sometimes those gory photos that people are more familiar with. And they combine them with new educational tools because, in fact, child-focused anti-abortion tools proliferated in the 1980s and 1990s, which shows that the movement is increasingly interested in children as an audience. So, I mean, these tools are numerous and varied. They began marketing a number of anti-abortion books to children, for example. And one of those books is where I got the title of the book. It's a 1986 book called You Are Special. And this is what the book, this is made for young children. And this is what the book tells a child about abortion. It explained, you began as a single cell when a sperm from your dad and an egg from your mom joined together. And at that moment, everything that was you was already there. And then the author of the book linked children's lives to abortion. They said, sometimes parents get confused and scared when they find out they're going to have a baby. They choose abortion. Abortion means they force their baby to die when it's still growing and living in its mother's womb. So compelling the child to envision, this was compelling the child to envision his or her own death, and also to push the young reader to identify with all aborted fetuses. This was once you, and if your parents had made a different decision, you would be aborted, right? So in addition to books, they sold foil fetus-sized dolls, movies, bumper sticker, fetus-sized stickers, T-shirts, and these, which I think are these like life-size fetus dolls, and these were supposed to have real feeling skin. But probably some of the most common tools that they generated and will be used with young people were these small plastic fetuses. The most common ones were called young ones. They were very cheap and they could be passed around very easily. And they were really useful in child-centered spaces. But all these tools, and especially the rhetoric around them, hailed children in two different ways, right? They're both being hailed as a potential future parent who might be faced with abortion, and also a once endangered grown-up fetus. So activism in schools, this is happening all over, but it didn't really make newspapers, even though it reached an incredible number of young people each year. We don't have a lot of precise numbers, but I have some. And so, for example, in the early 80s, Arizona Right to Life began to note in their newsletter where they gave talks. And according to them, in one 9-month period in Tucson, the group went to 60 classes in 8 different public high schools. And that meant that in one school year and in one school district, activists spoke to somewhere between 1,300 and 1,800 students. So this ephemera, and as it's being brought into many child-oriented spaces, was combined with new rhetorics in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s and 90s, activists really asked children to think of themselves as survivors of abortion because they were born, right? Or as many activists called them, survivors of the abortion Holocaust. And I want to give you one example of this rhetoric drawn from a rally in the Salt Lake City's Capitol Rotunda in 1988. There, anti-abortion activists was speaking to a crowd. Of course, they were speaking in January, sort of mourning the Roe decision on its anniversary. And there were children in the audience because they had been singing that day. And this is what this activist, Penny Leah, said. She really talked about children. She said, "Isn't it wonderful that their parents didn't abort them so we can hear them sing today?" And then she foretold this terrible future for the children present and America's youth as a whole. She said, "Abortion is the root of a modern American malaise that has helped create a nation of sad, frightened youths, many of whom turn to suicide." So these children's lives are now bookended by narrowly averted, quote unquote, murder and looming suicide, and then Leah plunges them into history. She said, "The children of today are troubled because they feel as though they are survivors of a Holocaust that dwarfs the Nazi campaign that exterminated Jews in World War II. The children we see here are survivors. They have never known a nation that hasn't killed children." So with the burden of survivor's guilt now on their shoulders, how could America's children be anything but depressed? Leah concluded her remarks with this: "Unless abortion is stopped, we will end up aborting this nation." So in this really fiery speech, Leah portrayed children as psychologically damaged, perpetually at risk, lucky to be alive, and harbingers of America's end, because they were hailed this way, especially as quote unquote survivors. Activists increasingly asked children and young adults to become activists themselves and speak on behalf of the fetuses who couldn't. So public schools and Capitol Rotundas, of course, were not the only places of these politicizations. In fact, they're not the most successful, right? Activists were much more effective when they brought their politics into Sunday schools or private religious schools, to evangelical rock concerts or teen-oriented religious publications, or of course into their own homes, which especially mattered for homeschooled children. But activist presence in places like public schools show how a large percentage of America's youth heard the anti-abortion pitch in the last 2 decades of the century, whether their parents wanted them to or not. So in the 90s, Americans could really see the success of the movement's efforts to politicize young people. Some might have seen young people protesting outside their local abortion clinic with signs naming themselves as near victims of abortion. They carried signs, maybe "I'm glad I wasn't aborted" or "survivors of the abortion Holocaust." Others might have seen children and young adults on the news when they participated in Operation Rescue blockades or other sort of radical blockades that were very common in the late 80s and early 90s. And still others might have just seen young children at an anti-abortion booth at their state fair, like this picture on the right here, in a more mundane political space. But in all instances, Americans really saw how effective this movement was at giving at least some children a personal relationship to abortion. So abortion, more so than any other issue, was social conservatism's political buoy. When other issues died, either in the polls or in the courts or in the court of public opinion, social conservatives could cling to legal abortion as this unwavering evidence of moral decay. This issue continued to galvanize the broader movement and draw new young activists and generate new political strategies. And in a pinch, any conservative politician could use the dog whistle of life to clarify this basic moral difference between two major parties. And in fact, the supposed immorality of abortion allowed and continues to allow the Republican Party to paper over a host of other sins that conservatives have historically cared about. Because for a good number of conservatives, there's no weakness, political, familial, or even sexual, that could outweigh the importance of a candidate's anti-abortion stance. And in the 21st century, we see the effects of this activism in the ways that even the Republican Party remakes its relationship to these politics. In the late 1990s, people like James Dobson of Focus on the Family and others like Pat Robertson of the Christian Coalition or Gary Bauer of the Family Research Council declared they would no longer be good soldiers for the Republican Party. They had been voting for Republicans for a while, but they had suffered moderate candidates who said the right thing about abortion during campaigns, but then ignored socially conservative policy while in office. But in the late 90s, people like Dobson demand that Republicans prioritize abortion and family values and sexual morality. And really after that moment in the 21st century is when we see Republican candidates and elected officials from Newt Gingrich to John Ashcroft to George W. Bush line up to be anointed by these socially conservative leaders. That they would no longer support people who wouldn't either put in anti-abortion laws or, of course, Supreme Court justices. And really, we're all faced with the world that these activists have made. In my home state, Oklahoma, Texans have been seeking abortion since their legislature functionally outlawed the procedure with SB 8. And Oklahoma, just a couple of days ago, passed a total ban on abortion that's supposed to take effect in the summer. Utah, of course, is one of 13 states that has a trigger law, which means that if Roe versus Wade is overturned, the state will immediately ban all abortions. And Roe versus Wade will most likely be overturned in a few months. Over half US states will either immediately or very quickly outlaw abortion. That we will again be in a world where medical migration for abortions will be central. Now, this isn't the end of the anti-abortion movement because the goal is not to send the issue back to the states, but to outlaw abortion across the United States. Surely the movement will next try to get courts to include fetuses as citizens under the 14th Amendment, which of course then would ban abortion across the country. But Texas Right to Life also shows us where this movement may go next. In its recently submitted amicus brief to the Supreme Court in Jackson Women's Health v. Dobbs, the group requested that the court overturn Lawrence v. Texas, which made sodomy laws unconstitutional, and Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized gay marriage across the country, alongside, of course, overturning Roe versus Wade. All three decisions they wrote were judicial concoctions and lawless. And of course, that's because all three in part rely on the idea that there is a constitutionally protected right to privacy. I didn't write this book thinking Roe was at the end of its life. But as that time approaches, we must all look back at the last 50 years with new eyes. It's clear that when Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, when those justices said that there was a right to privacy, and then in the aftermath of that decision, sexual rights began to be protected under the US Constitution, we must now know that 1965 was not the beginning of the future, but the beginning of a moment in time. And that time is almost over. In the next decade, women, pregnant people, and sexual minorities will surely find themselves with less rights, not more. And those rights will depend on what state you live in. We must also look back at the last 50 years and ask who and how has this moment ended? Who so decisively changed the tides of history? And I think some of the answers are in this book.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Sure thing.
So we've got lots of questions. I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to turn it over to my students first. If either of the folks that also joined us on Zoom wants to put a question in the chat, you're more than welcome to do so. But let me start with my students. Questions from anyone out in the classroom?
I just wanted to correct something that maybe I misunderstood.
Sure. So Jennifer, I don't know how well you'll hear us, but you can either come over here if you want,
Okay.
so, or I can.
Or I'm gonna touch your phone?
I don't know. I can't forget if I've got the sound on and that. Why don't you just talk to this? It'll probably be easier. Okay.
So
Technology.
I just had a question, and I think maybe I misread, but in the first.
I'm going to. Everyone relax.
Oh,
Rotate your phone.
Oh, well, okay.
Oh, so you can see Lisa.
Okay.
okay.
There we go.
Am I looking there? Okay, so I want to make sure I didn't misread your book. So in the first couple decades, you said that women who had the abortions were erased. And then
For what? Pardon me?
And then a few pages later.
No, she didn't hear you say erased.
Oh, erased. I got it. I got it.
Okay, so the women who had abortions were erased.
Yeah.
Is what you said. But then I read a few other spots where sometimes these anti-abortion activists would perhaps, instead of erase them, sort of label these women as immoral or victims, thus not truly erasing them. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah. Right. So yes, you read that, and there's so timing a little bit matters in terms of how that plays out in the book. That's a great question. So the book partly argues that the anti-abortion movement is really born from earlier socially conservative movements, right? Especially the anti-birth control movement and anti-pornography movement, where there is a more open discussion of the reasons why those politics are needed is order to like limit immorality, and especially women being untethered from marriage and all the terrible things that could happen when that occurs. But as feminism is rising, that's when the anti-abortion movement is growing. And so I don't know if this is sort of consciously made or not, but they really don't double down early on that kind of like women are immoral and we need to control their sexuality, and that's why. And so they really try to like marginalize her, because that is like the thorniest issue of the anti-abortion movement, is that if you make abortion murder, what do you make women who are pregnant, right? You make them murderers. But that's the thorniest sort of situation. So for a long time in the early years, they mainly tried not to talk about her. Or anyone who was pregnant who was seeking abortion, they just tried not to speak. But you see moments where that sort of the company line maybe from the movement, right, sort of briefly shatters. And actually some of the letters from the Utah archives were really important at the moment, that they're not movement publications, but they're anti-abortion activists and voters who are writing into their legislators. And that's where you see some of the more internal mechanisms underline that. And also in religious publications, less than sort of public-facing publications, you see them continuing to talk about women, as that their sexuality is a problem. But key, women as victims, is that sort of that chapter 4. That's this really essential innovation of the movement in the 80s and 90s, that they really start talking about them as traumatized, right, by abortion. And so they are not culpable, but victims too. And so they can also speak on behalf of fetuses. And that has been the most compelling rhetoric for the movement over the last 30 years. Like it really is. There's a certain number of people who've really bought it, and people who matter, like Supreme Court justices will parrot that like abortion's bad for women, that abortion traumatizes women, even though the American Medical Association, American Psychological Association say that this is not akin to PTSD. It's not a commonly traumatic event. So the place of women does change. At the beginning, they're really trying to not look like. They're born in a movement or a moment when, you know, a really different moment than our own, where religious activists, there's a deep skepticism about religious activists, and there is like not an acceptance of feminism, but like that they realize very quickly that like this is not, that line of rhetoric isn't going to work. And then they figure out, that's like the conundrum about women, they sort of figure out in their own particular way in the 80s and 90s around their rhetorics about victimhood and trauma. That was a long answer, sorry.
No, that's great, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Elijah, do you have?
Yeah.
I'm turning my camera phone around, and then you won't hear the students anyway, so they have to come up here.
I don't grab a chair.
If you wish.
So I'm
Oh,
not
it's good.
hovering over you.
Oh.
Okay. Hi, I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
You focused a lot on men who were part of this movement, and I wondered if you could speak to the relationship between anti-abortion activism and masculinity for all.
That's such an interesting question. I really thought I was going the other direction, because everyone really always wants to know about the women in the movement. And there are some good books about that, but thinking about the anti-abortion movement and masculinity, just give me a second here. This is like not something I put a lot of effort into. Obviously, I don't have any answers ready here. I didn't put a lot of thought into it, but really just my initial reaction is like a lot of the men in this movement are, well, I guess it depends. It depends on what part of the movement we're talking about. So a lot of the men that I interviewed were really a part of, not all of them, but a lot of them were part of more mainstream anti-abortion movements. And they, I think that their sort of relationship to masculinity really was about sort of, it was a religiously informed masculinity that was, they were all very committed to their faiths, right? And there was a sense of traditionalism that they appreciated, and also protect, like, I think that this like rhetoric about saving and protecting was really important to their sense of self. So especially in like the right to life movements, those were largely dominated by women. So the men were absolutely essential, and early on they're sort of put up as leaders, but they really have to share space and often are outnumbered by women. But of course, pretty famously, the rescue movement led by evangelicals is a much more male-dominated movement. Sort of Randall Terry's version of masculinity, I think, is like, it is deeply implicated in religious values, but also much more oriented around sort of sensational patriarchal sense being forward. And there's really, not my work, but other people have talked about how he really marginalized women activists in that corner of the movement. That you have these like radical right women, you know, who are really essential to the movement, they keep being marginalized by that kind of leadership. But that is just my initial thought. I haven't thought about men, which is sort of astonishing, because you just heard from Susan Johnson, who is my advisor, who writes all about masculinity, but I really hadn't thought about it. That's a very good question. I'll have to give that some more thought.
All right, thank you. And then, so I worked as a social worker for a long time, and I used to take a lot of people to get abortions. And during that time, there really was not picketers or this like antagonistic atmosphere outside of the clinic. And then in the last few years, that has totally changed here in Salt Lake, where there are people there every day picketing and yelling and doing all of that. And I noticed in the book that there are kind of like these flashpoints where it gets more antagonistic, where it gets more violent.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you saw like anything going on in the culture or in the politics that would sort of create that atmosphere. Like if you noticed a pattern of when it would get more sort of riled up and aggressive.
Yeah. Timing, I think, to be honest with you, my answer to that is really, it has more to do with place and what kind of organizations are, like how robust the organization is and whether they're making picketing their priority. So in certain places, it really depends on if you've got a group who has enough people and they themselves are galvanized enough to get out there. So maybe that has to do with, do they have a minister who's like regularly inviting them to be involved, whether they have an organizer who has these connections. And so I think it does have to do with time, but it has to do with more like the time where you have organizations that are committed to doing that kind of political work.
Right.
So that's like why I have a story in Arizona, and it really, like, certain clinics are just like constantly besieged, and other clinics, it is more like uneven. And sometimes that has to do with how famous the abortion provider is. But often it has to do with like whether or not the local organizations have committed themselves to picket. And so in Arizona, this guy, John Jakubczyk, came up with this idea of Project Jericho, because what he saw happening is like there'd be this intermittent picketing, but it never looked constant. And so he basically organized all the anti-abortion groups in all these churches, right, to basically take a time slot. So there are all these different groups. And of course, it only could work in a place like Phoenix where you had so many groups, but they could all take this time slot. So it looked like all the time the clinic is being picketed. And there are times of year that it happens, like during sort of the 40 days of life, like Catholics are being invited to picket, so there is some of that, but not, and of course that's picketing very different than blockading, right? Of course, that was a moment in time where activists blockaded, they broke the law, right? And they would descend on one place, right, at one particular time, and shut down clinics by first and foremost by putting their bodies in front of that and getting arrested. But then of course that often escalated into arson and murder sometimes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're going to keep rotating students through here. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Holland. Sorry, I was thinking back to Susan. I really loved your book and it was really wonderful. And I'm just wondering about your oral histories that you conducted with like anti-abortion activists, and how that process was for you just as a historian, and if it was difficult to gain trust between, or like the rapport, like just what was that process like? That seems really intimidating, above and beyond the normal fear I have over oral history.
Yes, it was. And I actually learned from up at Utah State some of the basics of oral history because they have such a good program up there. But anyway, it was like a really different kind of oral history. The oral histories are sort of the lifeblood of the book, and they were the hardest part for me to do. I knew I needed to do them, but they were hard, and they were hard for a few ways. So I was mentored by Michelle Nickerson. I don't know if y'all know of her work, but she did did a book about conservatives, and she did oral histories, and she sort of took a more feminist oral history approach. Like, she was very open about herself. She laid out all her cards on the table, and she built these relationships, and really relationship with one woman. These were, anti-communists largely. And they have, as far as I know, I don't know if the activist still alive, but they built a long-term relationship. And then through that relationship, Michelle Nickerson got access to other, and she was, it was always just everything on the table. And she was willing to build relationships with these activists. And I knew I couldn't do that. Like, I just knew I couldn't do that. But also I wanted to I had to go through the IRB process. I didn't want to steal from them, the ethics of oral histories. I felt compelled by them. But so I at first I was like, I just don't, I talked them through the project, and I said, I don't think that anyone's really written a thorough book about this. I'm really interested. I sort of made it, and And I realized within a few interviews that they just all assumed I was an anti-abortion activist myself, that I could not possibly be sitting in a room with them and asking them questions politely if I didn't agree with them. And of course, their reading of me matters. Like, I didn't look like a feminist, whatever that is, you know, race and gender presentation all matters, right? In that way, but they never, especially sorry, go ahead.
Academia. People always think of academia as this great, like, all the
I know.
That just surprises me, that the gut reaction of like, oh, you're an academic.
No,
that's really fascinating. Okay,
they would say things like, I don't know that I'm surprised Wisconsin's letting you do this. And I was like, they don't they don't control what I do. And also, and so, but then once I realized that they were misreading me, and then I sort of retooled my pitch, and I was like, I am a part of a group of historians who are not conservative themselves, but write about conservatives. And I thought that was very clear. I was like, I'm not giving my abortion politics, but I thought that was straightforward. Not straightforward enough. Then I had people just treat me like I'd never heard the word abortion before. And they were like, you don't understand anything about this. So I'll just give you all the nitty gritty, which was fine as an oral history, you know? Yeah. But to be honest with you, like, I'm sure this book could have been better if I were better at this. You know, like, I had activists who were like, I have a basement full of documents, come spend the summer with me. Or like, people were like, come to this conference, this anti-abortion conference, I'll introduce you to all these people. And after a few hours, I was just like, I just can't. I just, you know, I don't want a relationship with you. And I don't want to feel like I'm undercover. And I want this to be as honest as it can be. And that's sort of where we left it. And some of them asked for me to send the book, and I did. And I haven't heard from them. John Jakubczyk, who is the only one, I asked him one question and he spoke to me for 3 hours.
Wow.
He was a talker. And he said of someone else who wrote a story about him, that he said she said everything that was right. It was just that she interpreted it differently. And I hope that they would read that. Like, all their stories are there. And I think that they would say, like, yeah, all this is true. And it's true because, like, there is a genocide happening, you know, their interpretation of it is very different than mine. Yeah. So it was hard. It was really hard. And I was glad I did it. And for a minute, and I was thinking about another project, and I was like, I really need to study dead people because I just can't do oral histories again. But then now I was like, no, I really, then I was like, oh no, I'm going to do another late 20th century project and deal with live people some more. There's something compelling about dealing with issues that, of course, are still so with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have questions. I think other students might rotate in, but this is a typical grad seminar, 20th century, late 19th, 20th century U.S. history. And I was really struck by the term, what was it? The moral middle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which is just a fantastic term, right? Super interesting, super, super helpful. And of course, feels like it goes side by side with the moral majority, the silent majority, right? Those sorts of terms. How do you place your activists? And one of the cool things about the book is you're presenting their story. I mean, people know how you interpret it, but what you're saying is this is maybe the most powerful and influential social movement of the last 40 or 50 years, So you're not undercutting the work that they did.
No.
You're saying it was phenomenally influential. But do you place them side by side with these other parts of the conservative movement? I know you're saying that they are the most influential part, but do they fit together, or do they have tensions over economics or over race even, because they're not as openly racist as some conservative. I mean, so are there any tensions within that middle that you're writing about?
Yeah. So briefly, I would say the moral middle. I came up with that late in the book. It was like last minute revisions. But also is partly about place too, like not just the four corners, but like thinking about what's happening in many parts of the middle of the country. But thinking about alongside the moral majority and these big institutions, I think that the institutions, of course, have real. I really think abortion remains their ethos, their centerpiece, because like there is so many other things they like these coalition groups. Well, of course, the moral majority is a socially conservative group. It's not like a economically libertarian, economic conservatives or libertarians, which of course those are much more in tension with social conservatives, right? They could be. They haven't actually functionally been too much in tension. Actually, I think that's one of the things that a lot of scholars of the new right have shown us is like, this is amazing broad movement because it brings these different kinds of conservatives together relatively seamlessly, and all these different religious people who like relatively seamlessly who hate each other, and they sort of do, but they don't, and how successful it is. And of course, the Family Research Council, the Moral Majority, those are first and foremost socially conservative groups, and so they're not at odds around issues of abortion and strategy. They might be building national profiles on that, but that's rooted on this kind of activism. And I think that I think that there are debates within the movement, of course, about a variety of things, but I was interested in, especially with the rise of Trump, I was like, I'm interested, this movement, but really all parts, even the more racially oriented parts of the conservative movement have mainly used dog whistles, like throughout most of the period I write about, right? Like there's dog whistles, you talk about welfare queen, you can talk about thugs, right? Like these are dog whistles, but you don't say it. And the movement, the anti-abortion movement, I think that worked because like you can claim to be a civil rights movement, and then you can have other people who are still using, and you have anti-abortion activists who are using that kind of racially coded language. But of course, when the codes are taken away, and you say things openly, like what happens then for a movement that's really built itself off of thinking of itself as an extension of racial justice movements? And what I have seen is that there was not any conflict. That it was a very, that really, again, it's like Trump nominated Supreme Court justices, and that really covered over everything else. There really wasn't anything else that was important. And actually, as you might imagine with this project, I talked to a lot of journalists, and a lot of those journalists are going into anti-abortion spaces right now. Of course, my book doesn't go into now, but some of them have talked to me about this and said that they have seen this really interesting back and forth at anti-abortion conferences in just this last year, where they have these often young people who talk about themselves as progressives, calling themselves abolitionists, right? Like thinking of themselves as marching alongside, not necessarily alongside, but like sort of alongside like Black Lives Matter. But then in the afternoon, they shift over to like more of like all of the same sort of right-wing talking points, really explicit about racial resentments. And there's no friction, that everyone sort of just occupies the same space. And that's fascinating to me. And it's sort of, it feels like, because the argument in the book is partly about how they use this rhetoric, but there is still this like racial resentment, right? That's like underlying it. And I think that helps make sense of that, right? For a lot of that, those aren't actually unreconcilable, because it is really a co-optation. It's not, I'm not saying people don't feel it sincerely,
right?
But it's not a broad, deep, sincere commitment to issues beyond abortion that have to do with race, right?
So these groups are still meeting. One of my questions for you, which is just so presentist, but I can't help it. It feels like there's a story that says that Fox News is the organizer, right? That all discourse and agendas come through Fox News.
Yeah.
Versus the sort of, one of the really wonderful things about your book is like, no, it's not that high profile stuff. It's all these kind of grassroots organizations and putting in the hours, whether it's, for a crisis pregnancy center or whatever, right? That's what changed the movement over several decades. Does it still feel, again, this is very presentist, so I'm sorry, does it still feel like the grassroots is out there doing that thing? Or is
I mean, I think they're still definitely working, right? We see people protesting at clinics. I mean, and in fact, I think the last year, people are feel empowered and exhilarated. They see this this coming goal. But I think that conservatives, of course, are incredibly savvy about using new tools to reach new audiences. I mean, I sort of leave the book with James Dobson, but of course you can imagine that like Fox News and religious radio and like there are all these new forums that like magnify, like they're not in tension, the big forums and the grassroots. Like the grassroots is doing this kind of work, right? But then they really important grassroots work, rhetorical work. They're setting the stage in a certain way, and then you have these other platforms that can project it outward. And of course, I don't really watch Fox News, so I don't know what their abortion coverage is, but I can guess. But of course, religious radio, like people like Rich Limbaugh, like all that, they're like these major spokespeople. And I think that it's meaningful, but it's certainly not. I think the thing that you're absolutely right that the book disagrees with, and this is a common interpretation of conservative movements, especially socially conservative movements, is that there's someone at the top, pulling the strings, that Nixon sort of figured this out, that he was gonna, get these dumb religious people to vote for the Republican Party all the time. And he figured it out and then it was done. And that's just profoundly wrong. I'm not saying that he didn't have some strategies, but like, that's not why abortion became central to the Republican Party. It's not why it became central to our politics. It's just not. Right. Nixon's not the answer. Jerry Falwell isn't the answer, right? Like Jerry Falwell is like speaking to people who've already been politicized in their churches, and their homes and any number of other places.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's just, obviously we're living in this incredible moment, and it's the same thing with like Stop the Steal. I'm like, this must just be top down, but your model suggests that we're missing the story if we think this is just top down and we watch some clip from CNN where some person sounds not very smart, right? That we're fooling ourselves to not understand the actual thing that's going on with grassroots conservatism.
Yeah, and I really am going to say with social media, I'm like out of my element about how people's opinions form. Like I do have opinions just like anyone else, but I do not have them as a scholar. But I do think that totally lost my train of thought.
We were talking about Stop the Steal and social media, and the importance of grassroots folks, right? And I'm calling myself out for reading things too simplistically. This top-down model, which is ironic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are people. I was gonna say Trent Franks, when he said all that stuff about African Americans and abortion and slavery, everyone was like, this dude's nuts. Like they were just like, yeah, he's marginal, right? But like they just didn't understand. They don't understand that he sounds nuts to people who aren't fluent in that. But he's elected by people who are fluent in that.
Yeah.
And I think my impression is that sort of our modern moment, all these things just happen a lot faster than they were here. So I don't know exactly the relationship between social media and the anti-abortion movement, but I do know that in Norman, Oklahoma, like the anti-abortion movement has like like an abolitionist group has like a storefront on Main Street, and like they're always around, and they come to my university, and like they're present. There's crisis pregnancy centers in Norman, a number of them, like I can see that the movement exists around me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Other questions? Gary.
Hey, Dr. Holland, thank you for spending time with us this evening. Appreciate it. I just had a quick question. I'm what I guess might be called a refugee from the conservative side of the spectrum, maybe. And as I read your book, I was struck by the religiosity of the anti-abortion crowd.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if in your research or your travels, you encountered any significant portion of the population that was not religious, but opposed to abortion.
That's a very good question. So I guess, so because the book is so focused on activists, and really that was sort of the thing I looked at. You can imagine the amount of information that's been published about abortion since 1973 is enormous. And the number of polls people have done about abortion is enormous, and they keep shifting, whatever, they're both stable and shifting depending on the way you answer it. Right. So activists, they always trot out like one or two people they count as atheists. And they're sort of like Jews, they're just like, we actually don't have very many of them, but it's important that
kind of a token crowd.
Yeah. That we put them forward. And as you read in the book, early on, it's really important that even religious activists sort of hide their religiosity because they are facing often anti-Catholic audience more, but they are also facing a world that is not really comfortable with religious activists. And of course that shifts massively. But I would say, I don't know about voters per se, but I think the huge majority of voters, and certainly, I mean, besides the tokens, all the activists are religiously motivated. They are. But also, I really wanted to say in the book that I think people know that, but they also think that the movement's been so successful at being like the religious perspective is the anti-abortion perspective. And I wanted to, give you a brief sense that just wasn't the case. They were actually responding to a much more diverse religious community and really shifting ideas about abortion within religious communities. And so they really were always religious, and they were talking back to people they envisioned as secular, and also to their co-religionists who were also changing. But I'm not saying that no one who isn't religious like votes on abortion only. But I think because so much of this work is done in spaces that often end up to be religious spaces, it leads to certain religious white people to be the base, and the people who come out, now and then, you can see that that's sort of the case. I mean, even religious people of color, it's just, they might care about it, but they just don't vote on that issue usually.
Interesting.
Yeah, but no, not a ton of non-religious people.
Not
none. I'm not going to say not none. It's a big movement.
None, but no significant representation on
a
more liberal side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Enjoyed your book.
Thanks.
So we want to hear about what the next project is going to be. Then we're going to let you go after that and talk for many more hours about the 1980s in particular, but also about your book. So do you already have a thought or not yet?
Yeah, I'm starting to, writing a second book feels, I don't know, I should ask you about how this works. I don't know how this works, but it feels different than a first book. Like grad school is actually this wonderful time where they like take you step by step through each part of the process, and you might be doing your other jobs, but like there's a way you can focus on all those pieces. And so this, I'm like smushing all the pieces and rearranging them, and it's just not going in the order I expected it. So anyway, yes, I've already done some archival research, and it is about the anti-LGBTQ movement.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and it seems like, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But in some ways, it's not just that it aligns itself with the anti-abortion movement. It's actually that it's like different. That, my initial impressions are like, it doesn't have this sustained, like, grassroots momentum that, like, you have people on the ground sort of working, building, these little groups all the time. It sort of like shoots up and then shoots down, and shoots up and then shoots down. And they keep having to like change their rhetoric here and there, like there isn't this. And so, and also, I think that we are on the cusp of big changes about gay rights, and we still see the ways in which, recently, right, a lot of bills around trans athletes and gender confirmation surgery and don't say, all that is growing, but at the same time, we do have a lot that's been secured and really changes in public opinion in the last 20 years. I think we can't really say that happens with abortion. And so I'm just interested in the ways that it's like conjoined with this thing, and also like really different. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it is going to focus on the West. Partly, a lot of these happen in the West because like the West has so many referendums. You have all these like inheritance of the progressive West where you keep putting things to the voters. That's this tactic that anti-abortion, but certainly anti-gay activists use to really good effect, throughout the West, and of course other really important moments around queerness. But I've faced that like this is as wrenching a topic as perhaps more wrenching. Like when I'm in the archives, I'm like, I need to take a step away from like the AIDS epidemic, Yeah. It's and sort of people who are, I don't know. Yeah, it's brutal. So, but I keep being drawn to these traumatic topics. So.
I was gonna say, that at least you feel like you're seeing positive change, some kind of end at the rainbow, but then all of a sudden you look around, it's like, well, am I really seeing that? That's a hard project.
I know. Yeah. And it's like just like this project where it's sort of like a project where everyone is like, well, I think I know about that thing.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping to do with this, as I did with my book, is like, if we take this thing that you think and like, is there a way that we can see it differently? And like by putting all these weird moments together and sort of taking apart what, these assumptions we've got, like, can we see it? So I'm hoping that works out.
That's very cool. I will email you because my colleague and friend and teacher for many of these students, Beth Clement, is finishing a book on AIDS, and it's going to be great.
I've seen that, and you know what? I always teach her other book.
Good. Yeah.
I am like dedicated to that book. It's like, I teach it in my undergrad seminars. I teach it, like I actually lecture from it, and they're always like, "That's where dating comes from," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's where dating."
That's it.
Like.
So thank you again, both on behalf of myself and the students, and also the Aileen Clyde. And here's my last pitch on the Aileen Clyde. For any students that later come to this, maybe on YouTube or something else, please go take a look at the Aileen Clyde collection of materials that we've already started assembling at Marriott Library. So you can search for it that way. But thank you, Jennifer. Really appreciate your time and really appreciate the book.
Thank you.